My name is Austin Prince, and I'm one of the pastors at The Gathering at Decatur Heights in Decatur, Georgia. And I wanted to share this biography with you of the life of C.S. Lewis. He's a fascinating character of history. He wrote children's literature and medieval and Renaissance literary criticism, and he has a unique voice as he explains the rationale and beauty of Christianity. He's not a pastor. He's not a professional theologian. He's a professor at Oxford and at Cambridge. He's an incredible mind who was an atheist, who became a Christian, and used his time and creativity to explain the wonder and beauty and validity of Christianity in a unique voice. He's also a contemporary of J.R.R. Tolkien. He's actually a great friend of his, a contemporary of Winston Churchill. He had a great opportunity to speak and comfort the nation during World War II, and he also fought in World War I. Interesting character, and I hope you enjoy and are encouraged by the life of C.S. Lewis. I'd like to explain just a little bit about his life, a few of his major works and their importance, and then end by just encouraging you with some of the reasons why we enjoy C.S. Lewis and why you should too. C.S. Lewis was born on November 29th in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. He went by the name Jack for most of his life to his friends. He didn't really enjoy his full name. C.S. Lewis stands for Clive Staples Lewis. But they had a family dog named Jaxie, and C.S. Lewis wanted to go by the name Jack, which there's another famous fictional character who also liked to go by the dog's name, and of course that is the one and only Indiana Jones, whose real name was Henry, and decided to go by the family dog's name of Indiana. And Lewis's grandfather, Richard Lewis, was a Welsh boilermaker. He worked at a shipyard, the McIlwain and Lewis shipyard. They were engineers, and they would build boats. And that shipyard was bought out by the Workman Clark Company. And that's significant because the Workman Clark Company built the Titanic, or the infamous Titanic. And so to think about Lewis growing up around that environment, Lewis had this also neat point and tie to history, that he would hear the sounds and see the sights of this incredible ship being built. Of course, its maiden voyage was in 1911, Lewis being about 12 or 13 years old at that time. Lewis was the younger of two boys. His older brother, whose name was Warren, he went by Warnie, was 3 years his senior and played a massive role in Lewis's life. They later lived together, and Lewis was never a good typist, and so he would write his stories and his books, and his brother Warnie would type them up for him. Both the boys grew up in a home where their parents loved to read to them, and they were immersed in good stories. These became an extremely important part of Lewis's life, and he would describe it as placing longings in his heart and feelings for people that he never met that would overwhelm him with truth and joy. Lewis would later describe this feeling that he didn't know how to describe as northernness, something beyond, something somewhere was good and truth and beauty. Lewis later found out what that was and wrote about it beautifully in his works as a Christian apologist. But Lewis, his love for books was intensified when his brother Warnie was sent to boarding school, and it left him alone with his mother and his tutor and his father. And again, it would be a refuge for him, books would, at the age of 9, when Lewis's mother, Flora, died of cancer. And Lewis described that tragic event this way. He said it was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. The great continent, that was the stability of his mother, had sunk like Atlantis. So not really fully knowing what to do, Lewis's father Albert sent him, C.S. Lewis, or Jack, to boarding school as well. So Lewis at a young age was away from his brother, he was away from his father, he was now away from his mother, and he was sticking his nose and his imagination into books. Fast forward Lewis's life for the sake of brevity. Lewis applies and is able to get into Oxford. Lewis spent many years in specialized study and personal tutorship, And so Lewis was accepted at University College at Oxford University. This is a place that would shape him for the next 30 years of his life. But since the year was 1917 and World War I was a little over 2 years underway, Oxford was actually turned into military training ground, and Lewis would have to go to war before he could really begin his studies. And if you know much about World War I, often called the Great War, it was horrific trench warfare and the introduction to a lot of chemical warfare. Pretty rough place for Lewis to be. Lewis was he served in France from 1917 to 1918, and he was injured. Greatly shaped his life. And if you know much of Lewis's contemporary J.R.R. Tolkien, much of Lord of the Rings is shaped after this horrific imagery of World War I. But after the war, Lewis was able to complete his degree and secure a fellowship at Magdalen College. His specialty was medieval and Renaissance literature. Lewis's major scholarly work, which is still considered one of the best in its field, was he was asked to participate in the Oxford History of English Language series, or OHEL, OHEL, as he liked to reference it, in which he literally read everything from the 16th century that was published by an English author. It took him about 20 years, but what resulted was still one of the finest pieces of literary criticism that there is. And in this book, one note about this book is Lewis brings up this point which is called chronological snobbery. It's a funny term. Lewis, what you'll find out is that he has a way of saying things that summarize his ideas that are pithy and poignant. But chronological snobbery is this idea that just because something is old doesn't mean that it's out of date. Just because something is old doesn't mean that it's not true. The modern man tends to think that modern ideas are what's best. Modern ideas must be the best ideas, but it's really not true. And to a man who had his nose in 500-year-old books, what he knew was that there was much to be seen of truth and goodness and beauty in the ancient minds. And I think that's great advice for us today. By this point, though, before and during the war, Lewis had become a firm atheist, and this possibly springs from the tragic events of his youth, combined with a personal tutor who would challenge his beliefs on religion. Lewis felt that he could, in his words, see through religion. But Lewis's conversion to Christianity isn't one that seems to have a specific moment, but a series of wrestlings and revelations, much like many of our stories. This first stage of Lewis's conversion is that he was deeply captivated by the world of medieval literature. There was a realness and a cohesiveness to their worldview that grounded the works. It's why they stood the test of time. Great literature demands full commitment to the real world. This stood in stark and opposite contrast to the shallowness of modern writers of his own time, like H.G. Wells or Virginia Woolf. They were great writers, but their perception of reality, in Lewis's words, were thin and too simple. And so this is how Lewis would describe beauty in reality. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth, and on the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary, and nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. So Lewis sees beauty and truth and goodness, but he sees it in myth and fiction. And then he sees the quote-unquote real world, rationalism, imperialistic evidence, and he's not convinced of their beauty. Maybe they're true, but they ring hollow. And so he can't find a way to marry the two. Lewis later goes on to say things this way. Maybe I should preface this by saying that on a bus ride, Lewis said it finally clicked, that there was meaning and purpose in the world, beyond what he could understand. This isn't his conversion to Christianity, but just a consent that maybe there's more. And remember we said earlier that Lewis said he could see through Christianity? He later would write this quote, "You can't go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something beyond it. To see through all things is the same as not to see. Think about that for just a minute. Like a window or a pane of glass. The point of it being clear is so that you can see outside to something that's not clear. A tree or grass or an animal. Or what if that was clear? What if the tree was clear? What if the grass was clear? If everything were clear, you wouldn't be able to see at all. The point of being able to see through something is to see something solid on the other side. And so Lewis always thought he could see through religion. But if everything was able to be explained, then he wouldn't be able to see anything at all. There must be firm things, fixed things, real things that shape our ideas. Here's another quote to that effect. As the dry bones shook and came together in that dreadful valley of Ezekiel's, so now a philosophical theorem, cerebrally entertained, began to stir and have to throw off its grave cloths, and stood upright and became a living presence. I was to be allowed to play at philosophy no longer. This, however, was not Lewis's conversion, like we said, to Christianity, but merely his consent that there must be a God, a truth and meaning behind the world. The amounted evidence to Lewis was overwhelming. Fast forward to Addison's Walk. On the evening of Saturday, September 19th, 1931, Lewis went on a walk with one of his relatively new friends named J.R.R. Tolkien. After dinner, they went for a stroll along Addison's Walk on the college grounds, discussing the nature of metaphor and myth. When a wind blew, they retired to Lewis's room, where the conversation continued until about 3 a.m. Tolkien's advice to Lewis was this, and Tolkien was a Christian, and his advice was this: the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened. Keep in mind here that when they say myth, they do not mean fairy tale. They mean something that is true. Kind of like how a parable is a fictional story, but it tells you something true about the world. The great myth of Christ and all the truth in it would mean for the world is true. It really happened. And for Lewis, who loved myth, he loved the truth that would come out of fiction, he would look at the life of Christ and see massive amounts of worldly truth in it. The key difference being that Jesus was real. Jesus was not fiction. And it wrestled with his heart. This began to stir in his mind. Let me take a little side note to describe to you the relationship between J.R.R. Tolkien and Lewis, which is a fascinating point in history. It's where two massive literary giants meet up and share a beautiful friendship. They became fast friends because they both had expertise in language and in English literature. They would intentionally get together on Monday mornings and drink tea and smoke together, smoke pipes and different things like that. And Tolkien had been working on a side project, a story for children. He didn't really share it with anyone, but he decided to show Lewis, and Lewis loved it. The book was The Hobbit. It didn't have an ending, though. And so Lewis passed it on to a friend of his who moved it along to a publisher who asked for an ending, and he would love to publish it. But not only that, it did get published. Not only that, but years later, after refusing to do a sequel to The Hobbit, Tolkien had made an entire language and had made characters and a whole history of Middle-earth, but he really didn't have a story. And so Lewis forced him to make this world come alive with the story that we now know as Lord of the Rings. And it's fascinating that his input and his encouragement and really this environment that these friends spurred one another on to create good literature. Maybe as a side note, takeaway, we need to have friendships like that. Communities and mutual support encourage and bring out the best in us. Lewis writes about that a lot in his book, The Four Loves. One of the reasons why C.S. Lewis is famous are for his works. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining some of the massive works or major works, popular works by C.S. Lewis and their significance. But a decade after becoming a Christian, which, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but Lewis was, I think he was in a motorcycle sidecar with his brother, Warney, and they were going to the zoo. wrestling with these things, Christianity. And he describes it this way of going to the zoo, not becoming a Christian, and coming home from the zoo, he was a believer. It's just that simple. The coin fell in the slot. It finally made sense. It clicked. And he said on the way home, he was changed. And if that sounds strange, many of our testimonies are this way. Might not be some revelatory moment, but a slow process of gradual change where the Lord chips away on our mind and our heart. And so Lewis is great at explaining this later in his works, including this one that I'm about to share with you. About a decade after C.S. Lewis was a Christian, he was an incredibly popular lecturer. And it was also around the time that World War II was taking place, and the BBC wanted to find someone who would be widely broadcast to encourage the people and the soldiers who were at war. And since paper was in high demand and they couldn't get enough, they needed it to be a radio broadcast, widespread, encouraging, and but they didn't want a particular clergyman in case they would be seen to find favor with one denomination or one tradition. So what they got was C.S. Lewis, who was formerly an atheist and years later had become a Christian layman. So he was writing theology, but as a professor. And so they later compiled these radio broadcasts into a book called Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity comes from the term by the Puritan pastor Richard Baxter, and it's simply a way of saying that it's what is universally Christian. Lewis uses the example in the book about there being a great hallway called Mere Christianity, and these different rooms where the denominations are, Baptist, Anglican, Catholic. But in the middle of those rooms is a great hallway which they all share, Mere Christianity. But he also said that it's in the rooms where the fires are lit and the tea is drank and the couches are for sitting. So the rooms are good, but this mere hallway is Mere Christianity, which makes Lewis brilliant in a way, and his books are loved by Catholics and Protestants and all different kinds of people because it's so middle of the road true that we can all kind of agree that what he's saying is right. So Lewis starts the book not really assuming anything about the Christian faith nor the listener. He simply starts with what he calls the law of human nature. And that is that when you hear someone arguing with another person about what is right or declaring something to be wrong on a certain position or opinion that they hold, that there must be some standard that they are both appealing to. They can't both be right. So what's the standard? This is kind of Lewis's introductory moral argument. That if someone's complaining that something's not right, they're appealing to a fixed standard, a fixed point. And maybe a good way to see that is you don't know how loud something is, right? Something can be kind of loud or really loud, but you don't know how to measure it, what degree it is, unless you know silence. It's got to be a measuring point. There must be a fixed point. And so what is that fixed point in morality? How do we say some things are wrong or bad or really bad or evil? Well, we're appealing to some standard, some fixed point. Is it ourself? Is it our government? Is it some philosophy? Or is it God? So here's a few quotes from the book Mere Christianity. Can we complain about the state of a tree or rock? They have done no wrong. But they can be inconvenient to us. A rock or a tree doesn't have to behave a certain way. But a human ought to behave a certain way. There is a standard of morality, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So, why is it that we argue for truth? Why don't we argue that a wave crashing down on a building, we don't argue with that wave, some tragic event, because we have this deep belief that humans ought to behave a certain way. You see what I mean? Ought is this philosophical word of should, or there's something right. You're pointing to something that should be. And we all tend to do this. Most of the world tends to do this. Look at the news. Things ought to be different. But if they ought to be different, if they should, well, what should they be? And who gets to decide? By what standard? Also in Mere Christianity, you get the famous trilemma of Lewis's called the liar, the lunatic, or Lord. And this is basically the thought behind Jesus. Jesus is either a liar because he said he's God. He's either a lunatic, kind of crazy because he said he's God, or he's real. He's the Lord. And you have to choose. He can't be just kind of this nice guy, because how nice is he if he's lying? He really can't just be this kind of great moral leader. Well, is he that moral if he's a liar, or is he just crazy? Or really is he who he says he is? And you have to choose. Lewis kind of forces you to choose. You have to kind of put your money where your mouth is. You can't just have this nebulous Jesus. You have to take him on his own terms. And he's either the liar, he's either the lunatic, or the Lord. One more quote from this book. When a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still left in him. When a man is getting worse, he understands his own badness less and less. A moderately bad man knows he is not very good. A thoroughly bad man thinks he is all right. This is common sense, really. You understand sleep when you are awake, not while you're sleeping. You can see mistakes in arithmetic when your mind is working properly. While you're making them, you cannot see them. You can understand the nature of drunkenness when you are sober, not when you are drunk. Good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either. The next major work that really launched C.S. Lewis into popular writings was the book, the book Screwtape Letters, or a compilation, Screwtape Letters. In 1942, the Screwtape Letters were published. Lewis had gotten the idea one day while at chapel to write a series of letters from a retired senior demon to a junior demon that was starting on his first patient. What resulted was Lewis becoming internationally well known and being placed as a prominent voice in the 20th century Christian apologetics and Christian popular writing scene. Lewis has an amazing ability to get behind the human heart. In Mere Christianity, he diagnosed universal truths into the desire of the human heart, and in Screwtape, Lewis shows his hand as a master at exposing universal temptations. So here are some of the insights from Screwtape. Again, writing from this perspective of a senior demon who's retired, writing to his junior kind of apprentice about his first patient. Here's a little bit of a quote on faithfulness. He wants them, the enemy, God, to learn to walk, and must therefore take away his hand. And if only the will to walk is really there, he is pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but intending to do our enemy's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. So the enemy hates it when Christians, even while in the midst of a difficult world, in the midst of tragedies and trials, still obeys. They hate that. Here's another quote on twisting pleasure. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemies have produced at times, or in ways, or in degrees, which he has forbidden. What a powerful truth. Evil is not the opposite of good. Evil is bent good. Evil is distorted good. That's why it's so attractive to us. It's kind of like how when you go fishing, you throw in bait with a beautiful and attractive thing, but it's got a hook in it. It works the same way with us. We're not tempted by scary things. We're tempted by attractive and beautiful things, but that are bent, not for good, but for evil. The last work that I really want to highlight is Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This amazing 7-volume work for children. It really isn't for children if you've read them. They are, but they're for everyone. They are profound in their beauty. They're profound in their sensibility to kind of touch the heart and make you feel. They say about Lewis that Lewis can write in one paragraph or one sentence what takes many writers pages or chapters to write, and it's very true. He has a way of getting you to not tell you what you should feel, but make you feel it. And that's what he does a lot in Narnia. Narnia is not a complete, total allegory of the Christian life. He didn't exactly want it to be that way, but because the Christian life is true, and because fiction that's good talks about true feelings, that it just comes out in the world of Lewis. It comes out in Narnia, and it points in many ways to the truths and beauty of God. Here's a great quote from Narnia when the children first hear Aslan's name. They say Aslan is on the move, perhaps already landed. And when Beaver said this, a curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment Beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has something happen to you in a dream, that someone says something in which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all of your life and are always wishing you could get into the dream again. It was like that now. At the name Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside on beholding the true king. Aslan stood at the center of the crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves round him in the shape of a half-moon. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to do or say when they saw him. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of that now. For when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great, royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes, and then they found they couldn't look at him and went all trembly. His voice was deep and rich and somehow took the fidgets out of them. They now felt good, glad, and quiet, and it didn't seem awkward to them to stand and say nothing. Of course, we also need to mention the many characters and fascinating world of Narnia. But one of my favorites is the tiny mouse, Reepicheep, who is incredibly brave, has no fear, and upon Reepicheep's thought of going into battle, even if it costs him his life, here's his great quote. "My own plans are made," says Reepicheep. "While I can, I sail east in the Dawn Treader. When she fails me, I paddle east in my coracle. When she sinks, I shall swim east with my 4 paws, and when I can swim no longer, if I have not reached Aslan's country, or shot over the edge of the world into some vast cataract, I shall sink with my nose to the sunrise." In Lewis's works, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, he creates a longing sense inside of you. That great northernness that Lewis felt as a child, that great desire for something more, is the same desire that he instills in his readers, which makes him so important. You can read and read and read and read and read, and you can store up a lot of knowledge. But a great writer is one who makes you feel. A great writer is one who makes you believe what they believe in and love what they love. So why do we love Lewis? Lewis reminds us that our faith is not foolish, but it's reasonable. At the heights of philosophy, there is nothing to be afraid of as a Christian. Nothing at all. Lewis was a master pointer. The poet, this is Lewis's quote, is not a man who asks us to look at him, but he is a man who says, "Look at that," and points. The poet is thus not a spectacle to be viewed, but a set of spectacles through which things are to be seen. And Lewis is a master pointer. He points to the things that he loves. He points to the things that are true. And you glory in those things. And you kind of forget Lewis is there until you step back and see what a brilliant mind and pen it took to help you see so clearly. Like I said before, Lewis can say in one sentence what many authors take pages to write, which makes Lewis so fun to read. Makes you stop and think, but it's not difficult. It's profound. Lewis makes us feel. I've never felt the weight of temptation in the Garden of Eden like I did when I read the book Perelandra, part of Lewis's space trilogy, which is also fascinating. Just a quick note on that. The beginning book is about mankind going to space and landing on Mars, I believe it is in the first book. And instead of us finding in many of the works of sci-fi in that day that on Mars there were Martians and monsters, what happened was there were creatures there, but in Lewis's book, mankind who had sin and war and hate brought it to a planet that was innocent. And so we kind of see the corruption of man in a new way. Sometimes we forget how corrupt we are. Lewis was a human with flaws and failures, so it's good to study his life. And he had a keen ability to diagnose the universal experience of the human heart, sin, and desire. And that's why Lewis is profoundly important. His universal scope that pinpricks very specific things. It's universal and specific at the same time. Lewis is a master of myth. Just like Jesus would tell parables, that's the sign of a master teacher. If you can take an everyday, ordinary thing and derive from it truth and beauty and make people think, it's often the sign of the best teachers. Lewis was a master at this, and he turned his imagination to tell the truths of the gospel. Fascinating character, worth our time, and worth our thoughts. There's much more to be said about Lewis. I would suggest you check out Alistair McGrath's great biography on the life of Lewis. You can pick up Lewis's own autobiography in the book Surprised by Joy. Hope you enjoyed this short biography of the life of C.S. Lewis.